Her name is Grace. Just 9 years old. No family to turn to, no money in her tiny hands, just her heavily pregnant mother, Sarah, writhing in terrible pain on the cold, wet street, and the dark storm clouds above them. Every scream her mother let out cut through Grace's small heart like a sharp knife. She held her mother's shaking hand tight, running up to strangers walking by, begging them to help. But people only looked, whispered to each other and walked away faster. Please, please somebody help us. My mama is having her baby. Grace cried, her little voice cracking with fear and sadness. A few people stopped to look, but instead of helping they started laughing at her. Some shook their heads and said mean things to her. Others just looked with pity in their eyes and kept walking. But Grace's father had already thrown them out into the rain. He had slammed their front door right in their faces, his arm wrapped around another woman, a woman who wasn't Grace's mother. He had chosen his new girlfriend and his comfortable life over his own wife and daughter. And that terrible betrayal and the way he pushed them out had scared Grace's mother so badly that the baby started coming too early. Now, as Grace tried her best to help her mother get closer to the hospital that seemed so far away, she didn't know if they would make it. Her mother was getting weaker and weaker. The rain was making them both so cold. All Grace knew was that she couldn't give up. She couldn't stop trying. Because if she gave up now, she would lose the only person in the whole world who had ever truly loved her. Hello, welcome to our story. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Just a few years ago, Grace's family was poor, but they were happy. Her father Robert worked as a security guard at a big office building. He didn't make much money, but he loved his family. Every evening when he came home, he would pick up little Grace and spin her around. He would kiss Sarah on the cheek and ask about her day. They lived in a tiny one-room apartment. They had to share one bed, and sometimes there wasn't enough food for everyone. But Robert always made sure Grace and Sarah ate first, even if it meant he went to bed hungry. We may not have much, Robert would say, holding his family close, but we have each other. And that's worth more than all the money in the world. Grace believed him. She felt safe and loved. But then everything changed. One day Robert came home with big news. His boss at the office building had noticed how honest and hardworking he was. The boss decided to make Robert a manager of all the security guards. With this new job came much more money than Robert had ever seen in his whole life. At first, Sarah and Grace were so happy. They moved to a bigger house. Grace got her own bedroom with a real bed and pretty pink sheets. Sarah didn't have to worry about buying food anymore. Robert bought new clothes and a television. But the money started to change Robert in ways that Grace and Sarah didn't understand at first. Robert began staying out late after work. He said he was celebrating with friends, or making business deals. He started buying expensive clothes and fancy watches. He spent money on things they didn't need while Sarah asked him to save some for when the new baby came. Don't worry about the baby, Robert would say, not looking at Sarah. I have plenty of money now. Then Sarah found out about the other woman. Her name was Linda, and she worked at the fancy restaurant where Robert had started eating lunch every day. Linda was young and pretty, and she laughed at all of Robert's jokes. She didn't care that he was married. She only cared about the expensive gifts he bought her and the nice places he took her. When Sarah found out, she confronted Robert about it. But instead of feeling sorry, Robert got angry and mean. How dare you question me? Robert shouted at Sarah, who was now 9 months pregnant and could barely walk. I work hard for this money. I can do whatever I want. Robert, please think about what you're doing, Sarah said, tears running down her face. I'm about to have your baby. Grace needs her father. We need you. But Robert had already made up his mind. He looked at his pregnant wife with disgust, like she was something dirty he wanted to throw away. I don't want you and your useless baby again, Robert said coldly. You're just holding my life. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was the same man who used to rub her feet when they hurt, who used to sing lullabies to Grace at bedtime. Robert, this is your child. We are your family. My family? Robert laughed in a mean way. Linda is my family now. She's young and beautiful. She doesn't complain all the time like you do. That night, Robert made the most terrible decision of his life. He told Sarah she had to leave the house immediately. But Robert, I'm 9 months pregnant. The baby could come any day now. Where am I supposed to go? Sarah begged, holding her big belly. That's not my problem, Robert said, his voice as cold as ice. Take Grace and get out. I want you gone before morning. Grace heard everything from her bedroom. She ran out and grabbed her father's arm. Daddy, please don't make us leave. Mommy is going to have the baby soon. She needs to stay in bed. Robert pushed Grace away roughly. Don't call me daddy anymore. I'm not your father. I don't want to see either of you ever again. Sarah packed their few belongings with shaking hands while Grace helped her. As Sarah and Grace walked toward the front door, carrying their small bag, Sarah turned around one last time. Robert, one day you will understand what you're throwing away, she said softly. And when that day comes, I hope someone shows you more kindness than you're showing us tonight. Robert didn't even look at her. He just waved his hand like he was shooing away flies. Just go, he said. And don't ever come back. Sarah and Grace stepped out into the cold night. Behind them, they heard the door slam shut and the lock turn. They were now homeless, with nowhere to go, and Sarah was about to give birth any moment. 3 days later, while Sarah and Grace were sleeping under a bridge trying to stay warm, Sarah's labor pains started. The stress and sadness had made the baby come early. The pain was so bad that Sarah screamed, and that's when kind strangers found them and helped them get to the street where they were. Now Grace was trying desperately to get help for her mother, but people were ignoring them instead of helping them. And that's how Grace and Sarah ended up on the cold, wet street that night, with nowhere to go, no money, and a baby coming whether they were ready or not. As the rain poured down on them, Grace held her mother's hand and made a promise in her heart. I will never leave you, Mommy. I will never be like Daddy. But Grace was just 9 years old, scared and alone. She had no idea how she was going to keep that promise, or if they would even survive the night. Grace wiped the rain and tears from her face and looked around desperately. The street was getting emptier as the storm grew stronger. Most people were running to get inside, away from the cold rain. But Grace couldn't run anywhere. Her mother was getting weaker, and the baby was coming whether they were ready or not. Mommy, hold on. Please hold on, Grace whispered, squeezing her mother's hand. Sarah's face was pale and she was breathing very fast. Grace knew they didn't have much time. Grace ran up to every person she saw, pulling on their coats, begging them to help. But one by one they all found excuses to walk away. Please, my mama is having her baby. She needs help. Grace cried to a woman in a fancy dress. The woman looked disgusted and pulled her dress away from Grace's wet hands. Get away from me, you dirty little girl. Find your father to help you. Please, sir. Grace begged an old man with a walking stick. My mama is very sick. The old man shook his head and muttered, That's not my problem, before walking away faster. Some people stopped to stare, pointing at Grace and her mother like they were watching a show. Grace heard them whispering things like, Where's her family? And, probably just beggars looking for money. A few even mocked Grace's desperate cries for help. Grace felt her heart breaking. How could people be so cruel? Her mother was dying and they were treating them like they didn't matter at all. As Grace knelt back down beside her mother, Sarah grabbed her hand weakly. Grace, baby? I don't think I can. The baby is coming? No, Mommy. Don't give up. I'm going to find help. Grace stood up again, even though her legs felt like they might give out from fear and exhaustion. That's when Grace saw a taxi driving slowly down the street. The driver seemed to be looking for passengers. Grace ran into the middle of the road, waving both her arms. Please stop. My mama needs help. The taxi stopped and the driver rolled down his window. He was an older black man with kind eyes and gray hair. His name tag read Samuel. What's wrong, child? Samuel asked, his voice gentle. My mama is having her baby right here on the street. She's really sick and we need to get to the hospital. Please, sir, please help us. Grace's words came out in a rush. Samuel looked over at Sarah lying on the wet ground, and his expression immediately changed to one of concern. He quickly parked his taxi and got out. Oh, Lord have mercy, Samuel said as he knelt beside Sarah. Ma'am, can you hear me? We're going to get you help. Sarah could barely open her eyes, but she nodded weakly. How long has she been like this? Samuel asked Grace. The pain started this morning, but they got really bad just now. And we don't have anywhere to go. My daddy. Grace started to cry again. Samuel put a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. It's okay, child. You don't have to explain right now. Let's just get your mama to the hospital. Samuel was much stronger than Grace, and he carefully helped Sarah stand up and walk to his taxi. He laid her down gently in the back seat. I don't have any money to pay you, Grace said quietly as she climbed in next to her mother. I only have $3 and that's not enough. Child, Samuel said, looking at Grace through the rearview mirror as he started driving. Some things in this life are more important than money. Your mama needs help and that's all I need to know. During the ride to City General Hospital, Samuel drove as quickly and safely as he could. Every time Sarah cried out in pain, he would look back and say encouraging things like, "Hold on, sister. We're almost there." Grace held her mother's hand and felt a tiny bit of hope for the first time all day. Finally, someone was helping them. Finally, someone cared. "What's your name, little one?" Samuel asked Grace. "Grace," she answered. "Well, Grace, you are one brave little girl. Your mama is lucky to have a daughter like you." When they arrived at the hospital, Samuel didn't just drop them off. He helped carry Sarah into the building, with Grace running alongside them carrying their small bag. "Thank you, Mr. Samuel," Grace said as they reached the hospital entrance. "Thank you so much." "You take care of your mama, Grace," Samuel said, patting her head gently. "And remember, there are still good people in this world, okay?" Grace nodded and watched Samuel drive away before turning toward the hospital doors. The building looked so big and scary, but Grace took a deep breath. She had to be brave now. Her mother was counting on her. Inside the hospital, the bright lights hurt Grace's eyes after being in the dark, rainy street. There were people everywhere, some sitting in chairs, others walking quickly in white coats. The smell of medicine and cleaning supplies filled the air. Grace helped her mother walk slowly to the front desk, where a nurse in a crisp white uniform was sitting. The nurse had short blonde hair and was typing on a computer. She looked up when Grace and Sarah approached. "Can I help you?" the nurse asked, but her voice sounded cold and unfriendly. "Please, ma'am," Grace said politely. "My mama is having her baby and she's very sick. She needs a doctor right now." The nurse looked at Sarah, who was leaning heavily on the desk and breathing hard, then back at Grace with her wet clothes and messy hair. The nurse's expression showed that she didn't like what she saw. "Name?" the nurse asked in a bored tone. "Sarah Johnson," Grace answered quickly. "Insurance information?" Grace didn't understand what that meant. I don't know what that is." The nurse sighed loudly, like Grace was bothering her. "Does your mother have health insurance? A card that pays for medical bills?" Grace shook her head. "No, ma'am. But she's really sick. The baby is coming right now." "Well, then she'll need to pay the emergency deposit before we can treat her," the nurse said, not looking up from her computer. "How much?" Grace asked, her voice getting smaller. $200. Cash up front. Grace's heart sank. $200? That was more money than Grace could ever imagine having. She slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out her tiny purse, the one her mother had given her for her birthday. Inside was $3.47. It was every penny they had left in the world. With trembling hands, Grace placed the little purse on the desk and opened it carefully. She poured out the crumpled bills. "This is all we have," Grace whispered, her voice shaking. "Please, ma'am. It's all the money we have in the whole world. Please help my mama." The nurse looked down at the few coins and dollar bills, and then something terrible happened. She started to laugh. Not a nice laugh, but a mean, cruel laugh that made Grace's cheeks burn with shame. $3.47? The nurse said loudly so other people could hear. "You think $3 is going to pay for a hospital delivery?" Other people in the waiting room turned to look at Grace and her mother. Grace felt her face turn red, but she didn't move away from the desk. "But my mama is really, really sick," Grace pleaded, tears starting to roll down her cheeks. "The baby is coming whether we pay or not. Please, can't you help us?" The nurse's laugh got even louder. "Listen, little girl, this is a hospital, not a charity. No money, no treatment. That's how the world works." Another nurse walked over to see what the commotion was about. When she saw Grace's small pile of money, she started laughing too. "Look at this," the second nurse said. "She thinks $3 is going to buy medical care." Grace felt smaller and smaller as the nurses laughed at her. Her mother was in terrible pain, and these people were making fun of them instead of helping. "Please," Grace begged, her voice breaking. "My mama didn't do anything wrong. She's a good person. She takes care of me and loves me. Please don't let her die because we're poor." But the first nurse just waved her hand like she was shooing away a fly. "Marcus," she called to a security guard standing nearby. "Come escort these people outside. They're disturbing our patients." The security guard, a big man in a uniform, started walking toward them. Grace grabbed her mother's arm tighter. "No," Grace cried. "You can't make us leave. My mama needs help." "What kind of people are you?" The nurses just kept laughing and the security guard was getting closer. Grace felt desperate and hopeless. After everything they had been through, after finding someone kind like Mr. Samuel to help them get here, they were going to be thrown out anyway. Just when Grace thought all hope was lost, she heard a voice behind her, a calm, steady voice that cut through all the laughing. "Excuse me." What exactly is going on here? Grace turned around and saw an older woman, maybe in her 60s, with silver gray hair pulled back neatly and wearing a simple blue dress. She had kind eyes, but her face looked serious and a little angry as she stared at the nurses. The first nurse stopped laughing and tried to look professional again. "Oh, Mrs. Williams, we were just explaining to this child that we need payment before we can provide services." "I can see that," the woman said, walking closer to Grace and her mother. "And I can also see a woman who is clearly in labor and needs immediate medical attention." Mrs. Williams knelt down next to Sarah, who was now barely conscious from the pain. She gently touched Sarah's forehead and checked her pulse. "This woman has a high fever and is in active labor," Mrs. Williams said, standing up and facing the nurses. "How long have you been standing here arguing about money while she suffers?" The first nurse looked uncomfortable. "Well, we have policies." "Your policies?" Mrs. Williams interrupted, her voice getting stronger. "Your policy is to let a woman give birth on your lobby floor because a 9-year-old child doesn't have $200. Grace looked up at this woman with wonder. Who was she? Why was she helping them when everyone else had been so cruel? "Ma'am," the second nurse said, "we understand it looks bad, but we can't just give away free medical care to everyone who walks in here." Mrs. Williams opened her purse and pulled out her wallet. Without hesitation, she counted out $200 and placed it firmly on the desk. "There. Problem solved." She looked directly at the first nurse. "Now get this woman to the maternity ward immediately, or I will personally speak to your supervisor about how you treat emergency patients." The nurses' attitudes changed completely when they saw the money. The first nurse quickly scooped up the bills. "Of course, Mrs. Williams. Right away." She signaled to 2 other hospital workers. "Get a wheelchair for Mrs. Johnson immediately." As the hospital staff hurried to help Sarah, Grace stood there in shock. She couldn't believe what had just happened. This stranger had saved them. Mrs. Williams turned to Grace and knelt down to her level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Grace," she whispered, still amazed by what this woman had done. "Grace, my name is Mrs. Williams. I was here for my regular checkup when I heard what was happening. Are you hurt at all?" Grace shook her head. "No, ma'am. But my mama, is she going to be okay?" Mrs. Williams smiled gently. "The doctors are going to take very good care of your mama. But Grace, I need to ask you something important. Where is your father? Where is your family?" Grace's eyes filled with tears again. She didn't know if she should tell this kind woman the truth about what her father had done. What if Mrs. Williams thought they deserved to be thrown out on the street? He doesn't want us anymore," Grace said quietly. "He has a new girlfriend and he said we were holding him back. He made us leave and that's when Mama's pain started." Mrs. Williams' expression grew sad and angry at the same time. "Oh honey, I'm so sorry that happened to you." "Mrs. Williams?" A doctor in green scrubs approached them. "We're taking Mrs. Johnson to delivery room 3. The baby is coming very soon. Can I stay with her?" Grace asked quickly. "I promised I wouldn't leave her alone." The doctor looked at Mrs. Williams, who nodded. "Grace can wait in the family area right outside the delivery room," Mrs. Williams said. "I'll stay with her." As they walked through the hospital hallways, Grace felt confused. Why was this stranger being so nice to them? "Mrs. Williams," Grace said as they sat down in the waiting area outside the delivery room, "why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Mrs. Williams was quiet for a moment, looking at Grace with thoughtful eyes. "Grace, a long time ago someone helped me when I needed it most. I was young and scared just like you are now. A kind stranger changed my whole life by showing me compassion when others turned away." She paused and took Grace's small hand in her warm one. "Now it's my turn to help someone else." Grace could hear her mother crying out from behind the delivery room doors. Each sound made her heart hurt. "What if something bad happens to my mama?" Grace whispered. "The doctors here are very good, Grace. Your mama is strong and so are you. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is just keep believing that everything will work out." They sat together in the quiet hallway, Grace's small hand still held safely in Mrs. Williams' gentle grip. For the first time in days, Grace felt like maybe, just maybe, they weren't completely alone in the world. But she had no idea that this was just the beginning of how much Mrs. Williams would change their lives. Hours passed. Grace had fallen asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair, her head resting against Mrs. Williams' shoulder. Mrs. Williams had stayed with her the whole time, gently stroking Grace's hair whenever she stirred from bad dreams. Finally, at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Dorothy came out of the delivery room. He looked tired but was smiling. "Grace." Mrs. Williams gently shook the little girl awake. "The doctor is here." Grace sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Is my mama okay? Is the baby okay? Dr. Dorothy knelt down in front of Grace. Your mama is just fine, Grace. She's very tired, but she's healthy. And you have a beautiful baby brother. Grace's eyes filled with happy tears. A brother? Really? Can I see them? In just a few minutes, Dr. Dorothy said. Your mama is resting right now, but she's been asking for you. When Grace was finally allowed into the recovery room, she gasped. Her mother looked so pale and weak lying in the white hospital bed, but she was awake and smiling. In her arms was a tiny baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Grace, Sarah whispered as her daughter ran to her bedside. Come meet your little brother. Grace carefully climbed onto the chair next to the bed and looked down at the baby. He was so small and perfect, with tiny fingers and closed eyes. He's beautiful, Mama, Grace said softly. What's his name? I was thinking. Hope, Sarah said, looking at Mrs. Williams, who was standing quietly in the doorway. Because when I thought we had lost all hope, someone showed us kindness. Mrs. Williams stepped forward, her eyes misty with tears. Sarah, I'm so glad you're both okay. Sarah took Mrs. Williams' hand. I don't know how to thank you. You saved us. Without you, I don't know what would have happened to Grace and me tonight. You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Williams said gently. But Sarah, I do need to ask, where will you go when you leave the hospital? Do you have somewhere safe to stay? Grace watched as her mother's face fell. The happiness of baby Hope's safe arrival was quickly replaced by the reality of their situation. We don't have anywhere to go, Sarah admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Grace's father threw us out 3 days ago. We've been sleeping under bridges and in doorways. I don't have a job, and now with the baby. Sarah started to cry quietly. Grace reached over and held her mother's free hand. It's okay, Mama. We'll figure it out. We always do. But Grace was scared too. Where would they go with a brand new baby? How would they find food and shelter? Harmattan was coming, and it would be even colder on the streets. Mrs. Williams was quiet for a long moment, looking at Sarah, Grace, and tiny baby Hope. Then she made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. Sarah, I have a large house with several empty bedrooms. I have lived alone since my husband passed away 5 years ago. She paused and looked directly at Sarah. Would you and your children like to come stay with me until you get back on your feet? Grace's mouth fell open. Sarah stared at Mrs. Williams in disbelief. Mrs. Williams, we couldn't possibly impose on you like that. You've already done so much. You wouldn't be imposing, Mrs. Williams said firmly. My house has been too quiet for too long. And Grace here reminds me of myself at her age, brave, loyal, and determined to take care of the people she loves. Grace looked back and forth between her mother and Mrs. Williams, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. But we have nothing to offer you in return, Sarah said. No money, no way to pay rent. Mrs. Williams smiled. Sarah, I don't need your money. I need your company. I need to hear children's laughter in my house again. I need to feel like I'm making a difference in someone's life. She sat down in the chair next to Grace. And if you're comfortable with it, maybe once you've recovered from having the baby, I can help you find a good job so you can build a new life for your family. Grace couldn't contain herself any longer. Mama, please say yes. Please. Sarah looked at her daughter's hopeful face, then down at baby Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms, then at Mrs. Williams, who was waiting patiently for an answer. Mrs. Williams, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face, I don't understand why you're being so kind to us, but yes, we would be grateful beyond words. Mrs. Williams reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. Then it settled. When the hospital releases you tomorrow, you're coming home with me. Grace couldn't believe it. Just 12 hours ago, they had been on the cold, wet street with nowhere to go and no one to help them. Now they had a safe place to live, and baby Hope was healthy and beautiful. Mrs. Williams? Grace said quietly. Are you an angel? Mrs. Williams laughed softly. No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who believes that we're all put on this earth to help each other. Your mama and you have been through something terrible, but that doesn't mean your story has to end sadly. As Grace sat there holding her baby brother while her mother slept peacefully, she thought about what Mrs. Williams had said. Maybe their story was just beginning, not ending. But Grace was still just 9 years old. She couldn't imagine how much her life was about to change, or what amazing things were waiting for her in the years to come. The next morning, Mrs. Williams arrived at the hospital early with a car seat for baby Hope and clean clothes for Grace and Sarah. Grace had never seen clothes so nice and soft, a pretty blue dress that fit her perfectly and warm socks that didn't have holes in them. How did you know what size I wear? Grace asked, amazed. I have a good eye for these things, Mrs. Williams said with a wink. And I might have asked one of the nurses to help me guess. When they left the hospital, Grace pressed her face against the car window as Mrs. Williams drove through parts of the city Grace had never seen before. The houses got bigger and prettier with green lawns and flower gardens. Mrs. Williams, Grace said quietly, are you sure you want us to stay with you? We're not used to nice things. What if we break something? Mrs. Williams looked at Grace through the rearview mirror. Grace, honey, things can be replaced. People cannot. You and your mama and baby Hope are much more important than any object in my house. When they pulled into the driveway of Mrs. Williams' house, Grace gasped. It was the most beautiful house she had ever seen, 2 stories tall, painted white with green shutters and a front porch with rocking chairs. This is where you live, Grace whispered. This is where we live now, Mrs. Williams corrected gently. Inside the house was even more amazing. There were soft carpets, comfortable furniture and pictures on the walls. Everything was clean and bright. Grace was almost afraid to walk on the pretty rugs with her shoes. Grace, let me show you your room, Mrs. Williams said, leading her up a staircase with a smooth wooden railing. Grace's room was like something from a fairy tale. It had a real bed with a fluffy comforter, a desk by the window and even bookshelves with actual books on them. There was a closet bigger than the bathroom in her old apartment, and toys that looked like they had never been played with. This is really mine? Grace asked, touching the soft bedspread. All yours, Mrs. Williams said. And Sarah, your room is right next door with a crib for baby Hope. Sarah was standing in the hallway holding the baby, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Williams, I don't know what to say. This is more kindness than I ever thought existed in the world. The only thing I ask, Mrs. Williams said, is that you let me help you build a good life for your children. Grace needs to be in school and you need time to recover and then find meaningful work. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Williams kept her promise. She helped Sarah register Grace for school at the local elementary school, a much better school than Grace had attended before with newer books and kind teachers. On Grace's first day, Mrs. Williams walked her to the classroom door. What if the other kids don't like me? Grace asked nervously. What if they can tell I used to be poor? Mrs. Williams knelt down and straightened Grace's new school uniform. Grace, you were never poor in the ways that matter. You have courage, kindness, and intelligence. Those are the riches that count. Grace's teacher, Mrs. Nancy, was gentle and patient. When Grace was too shy to raise her hand in class, Mrs. Nancy would quietly encourage her. When Grace struggled with math problems because she had missed so much school, Mrs. Nancy stayed after class to help her catch up. Grace is a remarkable child, Mrs. Nancy told Mrs. Williams during a parent conference. She works harder than any student I've ever taught. She has this determination to learn everything she can, like she knows education is precious. At home, Mrs. Williams would help Grace with her homework every evening after dinner. She taught Grace how to use the computer, how to look up words in the dictionary, and how to organize her thoughts when writing essays. Mrs. Williams, Grace said one evening as they worked on a science project together, why do you know so much about everything? Mrs. Williams smiled. I was a teacher for 35 years, Grace. I taught 5th grade at Washington Elementary School. I always dreamed of having a daughter to help with schoolwork, but my husband and I were never blessed with children of our own. Grace looked up from her project. So I'm like, your daughter now? If you'd like to be, Mrs. Williams said softly. I would be honored to be your family, Grace. Meanwhile, Mrs. Williams was helping Sarah too. Once Sarah had recovered from giving birth, Mrs. Williams used her connections to help Sarah get a job at the Grand Plaza Hotel downtown, not as a cleaner, but as a front desk assistant. But I don't have experience in hotel management, Sarah protested when Mrs. Williams told her about the interview. You have something better, Mrs. Williams replied. You have integrity, politeness, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. The manager, Mr. Thompson, is an old friend of mine. He's willing to train the right person, and I assured him you are exactly that. Sarah got the job. For the first time since Robert had abandoned them, she put on professional clothes and went to work somewhere she could be proud of. She learned how to check guests in and out, handle reservations, and solve problems with a smile. Grace, Sarah said after her first week at work, I actually feel like myself again. Like I'm more than just someone who got thrown away. Grace watched her mother transform from the broken, scared woman on the street into someone confident and capable. Sarah stood taller, smiled more, and even started singing lullabies to baby Hope again. But the most amazing change was happening to Grace herself. With good food, a safe place to sleep, and adults who believed in her, Grace began to flourish at school. Her grades went from barely passing to honor roll. She joined the school science club and discovered she loved learning about how the human body works. One day Grace came home from school with a big announcement. "Mrs. Williams, I know what I want to be when I grow up," Grace said, dropping her backpack by the door. "Oh, what's that, sweetheart?" "I want to be a nurse," Grace said firmly. "I want to help people who are scared and hurt just like you helped us." Mrs. Williams' eyes filled with tears of pride. "Grace, I think you would make the most wonderful nurse in the world." But as Grace dreamed about her future, none of them knew that across town, Robert was about to learn a very hard lesson about the choices he had made. While Grace, Sarah, and baby Hope were building a beautiful new life with Mrs. Williams, Robert was living a very different story. At first, after he had thrown his family out, Robert felt free and happy. He spent his days working at his well-paying job and his evenings taking Linda to expensive restaurants and buying her jewelry. He bought a fancy car and moved into a bigger apartment with Linda. For a while, Robert convinced himself he had made the right choice. "See how much better life is without them holding us back," Robert would say to Linda as they drank expensive wine and planned expensive vacations. Linda would smile and agree, but Robert didn't notice that her smiles never reached her eyes when she looked at his wallet. But Robert's happiness didn't last long. The guilt of what he had done to Grace and Sarah began eating away at him, especially late at night when he couldn't sleep. He would remember Grace's little face begging him not to make them leave and Sarah's words, "One day you will understand what you're throwing away." To push away these uncomfortable feelings, Robert started spending even more money. He bought Linda a diamond bracelet for no reason. He took her on a cruise to the Caribbean. He bought expensive clothes and gadgets he didn't need. "Robert, honey," Linda said one evening as she admired her new gold watch, "you're so generous. I'm the luckiest woman in the world." But Robert noticed that Linda only said sweet things like this when he was giving her gifts. When he came home tired from work and just wanted to talk, Linda was always busy looking at her phone or getting ready to go out. Meanwhile, Robert's spending was getting out of control. He started using credit cards to pay for Linda's expensive tastes. Then he began borrowing money from friends and coworkers. His debts grew bigger and bigger, but he was too proud to admit he was in trouble. One day at work, Robert's boss called him into his office. "Robert, I've been looking at the company's finances, and I've noticed some discrepancies in the security department budget," his boss said seriously. Robert felt his stomach drop. In his desperation to keep Linda happy, he had been taking small amounts of money from the company accounts, planning to pay it back later. But later had never come. "Sir, I can explain," Robert started. "Robert, I trusted you. You were one of my most reliable employees. But I can't ignore what the audit showed. I'm going to have to let you go, and if you don't pay back what you took within 30 days, I'll have to press charges." Robert left the office that day knowing his life was falling apart. He had lost his good job, he owed thousands of dollars to the company, and his credit cards were maxed out. But the worst part was still to come. When Robert got home and told Linda what had happened, her reaction shocked him. "You got fired?" Linda said, her voice suddenly cold. "What do you mean you got fired?" "Linda, it's going to be okay. I'll find another job. We just need to cut back on spending for a while." "Cut back?" Linda laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. "Robert, I didn't sign up for cutting back. I'm not going to live like some poor person." "But Linda, I thought you loved me," Robert said desperately. Linda looked at him like he was stupid. "Robert, I loved what you could give me. The dinners, the jewelry, the trips. Without those things, what are you? Just a middle-aged man with no family and no money." That night, while Robert was at work trying to find a new job, Linda packed all her things and left. She didn't even leave a note. She just took all the jewelry he had bought her and moved in with a younger, richer man she had been seeing behind Robert's back. Robert came home to an empty apartment and a pile of bills he couldn't pay. For the first time since he had abandoned Grace and Sarah, Robert realized what he had lost. He had thrown away a wife who truly loved him and a daughter who thought he was a hero, for a woman who only loved his wallet. Sarah was right, Robert whispered to himself as he sat alone in his empty apartment. I didn't know what I was throwing away. But now it was too late. He had no idea where Grace and Sarah were, or if they were even still alive after he had thrown them out on that terrible night. All he had left was debt, loneliness, and the memory of the worst mistake of his life. As the months passed, Robert's situation got worse and worse. He couldn't find a good job because word had spread about what he had done at his last company. He had to sell his car and move to a tiny, dirty apartment in a bad part of town. He ate cheap food and wore old clothes. But worst of all, Robert was getting sick. The stress and guilt were making his body weak. He developed high blood pressure and heart problems, but he couldn't afford to go to the doctor. Robert had become exactly what he once feared, being poor, alone, and forgotten. Meanwhile, across town, Grace was growing up into an amazing young woman. She was now 15 years old and one of the best students in her high school. She had grown tall and beautiful, with the same kind eyes she'd had as a little girl, but now they showed wisdom and determination. Grace spent her free time volunteering at the local hospital, learning from the nurses and doctors. She still remembered that terrible night when her family had been turned away, and she was determined that no patient would ever be treated with cruelty on her watch. "Grace, you have a gift for this work," said Nurse Dorothy, who had become Grace's mentor. "You have healing hands and a healing heart." Grace would come home from the hospital and tell Mrs. Williams and her mother about everything she had learned. "Today I helped a little boy who was scared of getting his blood drawn," Grace would say excitedly. "I held his hand and told him a story about brave knights, and he didn't cry at all." Mrs. Williams would smile with pride. Sarah, now successful in her hotel management career, would hug her daughter and say, "Grace, you're going to change so many lives." Baby Hope was now 6 years old and starting first grade. He was a happy, smart little boy who loved books and drawing. He had no memory of that terrible night when he was born, only the love and security of the family that had raised him. But Grace had never forgotten that night, or the promise she had made to herself about helping people who were scared and hurt. None of them knew that very soon, Grace would have the chance to prove just how much she had grown, and how different she was from the father who had abandoned them all those years ago. It was a hot Tuesday afternoon in July. Grace had just finished her shift volunteering at City General Hospital, the same hospital where she had been born 9 years earlier. She was now 18 years old and had just graduated from high school with honors. In the fall, she would start nursing school on a full scholarship she had earned through her excellent grades and volunteer work. Grace was walking through the hospital lobby, heading home to celebrate her acceptance into the nursing program with Mrs. Williams, her mother Sarah, and her little brother Hope, when she heard a commotion near the emergency room entrance. Paramedics were rushing in with a man on a stretcher. He appeared to be unconscious, and Grace could see he was very thin and poorly dressed. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he looked like he hadn't eaten well in a long time. "What happened?" one of the emergency room nurses asked the paramedic. "Found him collapsed in the marketplace downtown," the paramedic replied. "Witnesses say he just fell over while walking. No identification on him. Looks like he's been living rough for a while. Blood pressure is dangerously high, and his heart rate is irregular." Grace watched from a distance as the medical team took the man into one of the emergency rooms. Something about the situation tugged at her heart. A homeless man with no identification, no family to call, lying unconscious and alone. "Grace," called Nurse Dorothy, who had been Grace's mentor for the past 3 years. "I thought you had gone home for the day." "I was just leaving when I saw them bring that man in," Grace said, nodding toward the emergency room. "Does he have anyone with him? Any family?" Nurse Dorothy shook her head sadly. "No, honey. No identification, no emergency contacts. He'll probably wake up alone if he wakes up at all. His condition looks pretty serious." Grace felt a familiar stirring in her heart, the same feeling she'd had as a little girl when she saw people suffering and wanted to help them. Even though she was just a volunteer and not yet a real nurse, Grace had been given special permission to assist with patient care because of her dedication and skill. "Nurse Dorothy," Grace said carefully, "would it be okay if I checked on him later? I know I'm not officially assigned to the emergency department, but—" "Grace, you have such a compassionate heart," Nurse Dorothy said with a smile. "Dr. Rodriguez is handling his case. I'm sure she wouldn't mind if you helped monitor him once he's stabilized. You know this hospital's policy. We treat everyone with dignity, regardless of whether they can pay." Grace nodded, remembering how different this hospital's attitude was now compared to that terrible night 9 years ago when she and her mother had been laughed at and nearly thrown out. New management and policies had changed everything about how patients were treated. A few hours later, Grace was informed that the man had been moved to a regular room on the 3rd floor. His condition had stabilized, but he was still unconscious. The doctor said he was suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, and heart problems brought on by stress and poor living conditions. Grace took the elevator to the 3rd floor, carrying a small cup of ice chips and a damp cloth to make the patient more comfortable when he woke up. As she approached room 314, she could see through the partially open door that the man was alone, just as Nurse Dorothy had said. Grace knocked softly and entered the room. "Hello," she said quietly, even though the man couldn't hear her. "My name is Grace and I'm here to help take care of you." She set down the ice chips and pulled a chair closer to the bed so she could check his vital signs the way she had been taught. As she leaned over to adjust his pillow, Grace got her first good look at the man's face. Her hands froze in midair. Even though he looked much older, thinner, and sicker than she remembered, Grace would know that face anywhere. It was a face she had tried so hard to forget but never could. It was the face that had haunted her dreams and her memories for 9 long years. It was her father. Robert Johnson was lying unconscious in the hospital bed, looking nothing like the proud, well-dressed man who had thrown his family out into the rain all those years ago. His hair was gray and thin, his clothes were old and dirty, and his face was pale and gaunt. Grace's first instinct was to run out of the room and ask someone else to take care of this patient. Her heart was pounding and her hands were shaking. This was the man who had abandoned her and her pregnant mother. This was the man who had chosen money and another woman over his own family. But as Grace stood there looking at her father's unconscious form, she remembered something Mrs. Williams had taught her. "Grace, being a nurse means you help people not because of who they are or what they've done, but because they need help. That's what makes the difference between a good nurse and a great one." Grace took a deep breath and sat down in the chair beside her father's bed. Whatever he had done to her family, right now he was just a sick man who needed medical care. And Grace had made a promise to herself long ago that she would never turn away from someone who needed help. She checked his pulse, noted his breathing, and made sure he was comfortable. Then she sat back in her chair and really looked at the man who had once been her hero. "What happened to you, Daddy?" Grace whispered, tears starting to form in her eyes. Grace sat there for nearly an hour, watching her father's chest rise and fall with each breath. She found herself studying his face, looking for traces of the man she had once loved so much. His hands, which used to lift her up and spin her around, were now thin and rough. His face, which used to light up when he saw her, was now pale and worn with lines of worry and sadness. Despite everything he had done, Grace felt her heart breaking for this broken man lying before her. She couldn't help but remember the good times, when he would read her bedtime stories, when he taught her how to ride a bicycle, when he promised that everything would always be okay as long as they had each other. "Those were lies, weren't they?" Grace said softly. "You didn't mean any of it." Just then Robert began to stir. His eyelids fluttered and he made a soft groaning sound. Grace quickly wiped her tears and sat up straighter, switching back into her professional mode. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" Grace said in the gentle voice she used with all her patience. "You're in the hospital. You're safe now." Robert's eyes opened slowly, and he looked around the room with confusion. His gaze was unfocused at first, but gradually his eyes found Grace's face. For a moment he just stared at her without recognition. Grace held her breath, wondering if he would remember her after all these years. Then slowly Robert's eyes widened. His mouth fell open slightly, and Grace could see the exact moment when recognition hit him like a lightning bolt. "Grace?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Grace, is that really you?" Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it, but she kept her voice steady and professional. "Yes, Mr. Johnson. I'm Grace and I'm here to help take care of you." Robert tried to sit up in the bed but he was too weak. "Grace, my little Grace, you're so grown up. You're beautiful." Grace noticed that he called her Mr. Johnson instead of Daddy, but she didn't comment on it. "You need to rest, Mr. Johnson. You've been very sick." "Grace, Robert's eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe it's really you. Where is your mother? Is Sarah okay?" Grace felt a flash of anger. Now he wanted to know about her mother? After 9 years of not caring whether they lived or died. "My mother is fine," Grace said coolly. "She's doing very well, actually." Robert looked relieved, but then his expression changed to one of shame and regret. "Grace, I need to tell you. I need to say." "Mr. Johnson, you need to save your strength," Grace interrupted. "You've had a heart episode and your blood pressure is dangerously high. The most important thing right now is your recovery." But Robert wouldn't be quiet. Tears were now streaming down his face. "Grace, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you and your mother. I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong." Grace felt her own eyes filling with tears but she blinked them back. "Mr. Johnson. Please," Robert begged, reaching out a shaky hand toward her. "Please call me. Please, can you still call me Daddy? Just once." Grace looked at his outstretched hand but didn't take it. The little girl inside her wanted to reach out and hold her father's hand, but the woman she had become knew better. "I can't do that," Grace said quietly. That name belongs to someone who loved his family enough to protect them. You gave up the right to that name 9 years ago. Robert's hand fell back to the bed, and he closed his eyes as if Grace's words had physically hurt him. You're right, he whispered. I lost that right the night I threw you out in the rain. Grace was surprised. She had expected him to make excuses or try to justify what he had done. She hadn't expected him to admit he was wrong so completely. What happened to you? Grace asked, unable to keep the question inside any longer. How did you end up like this? Robert opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. I lost everything, Grace. My job, my money, my health. Linda left me the moment I couldn't buy her expensive things anymore. I've been living on the streets for over a year now. Grace felt a complex mix of emotions, sadness, anger, and something that might have been satisfaction that the woman who had helped destroy their family had abandoned him too. I kept thinking about what your mother said that night, Robert continued. One day you will understand what you're throwing away. She was right, Grace. I threw away the only real love I ever had for something that was fake and empty. Grace listened without responding, trying to process everything she was feeling. I looked for you and your mother, Robert said, his voice getting weaker. After Linda left, I tried to find you both. I wanted to apologize to see if there was any way, but you had disappeared. I didn't know if you were alive or dead, and it was all my fault. We survived, Grace said simply. We found people who actually cared about us. Robert nodded, more tears falling. I'm glad. I'm so glad you survived. You deserve so much better than what I gave you. Grace stood up from her chair. This conversation was becoming too emotional, and she needed to maintain her professional distance. Mr. Johnson, visiting hours will be ending soon. You should get some rest. The doctor will want to run more tests tomorrow. Grace, wait, Robert said as she moved toward the door. Will I see you again? Grace paused with her hand on the door handle. She turned back to look at this man who had once been the most important person in her world and was now just another patient. I'm assigned to this floor, Grace said carefully. If you need medical assistance, someone will be here to help you. It wasn't really an answer, but it was all Grace could give him right now. As Grace walked out of the room, she could hear Robert crying softly behind her. Part of her wanted to go back and comfort him, but a stronger part of her knew she needed time to think about what this unexpected reunion meant for her and her family. Grace took the elevator down to the lobby and sat on a bench outside the hospital, trying to process everything that had just happened. Her hands were still shaking, and her mind was racing with memories and emotions she had tried so hard to bury. After sitting there for nearly an hour, Grace pulled out her phone and called Mrs. Williams. Grace, dear, are you coming home for dinner? We're waiting to celebrate your nursing school acceptance, Mrs. Williams' warm voice said through the phone. Mrs. Williams, Grace said, her voice barely steady, I need to tell you something. I just saw my father. He's a patient at the hospital. There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment. Then Mrs. Williams said gently, Come home, Grace. We'll talk about this together. When Grace arrived home, Mrs. Williams, Sarah, and young Hope were waiting for her in the living room. Grace told them everything, how she had found Robert unconscious and alone, how sick and broken he looked, and how he had begged for forgiveness. Sarah listened without saying a word, her face showing a mixture of sadness and old pain. When Grace finished her story, Sarah reached over and took her daughter's hand. Grace, Sarah said softly, what do you want to do? I don't know, Mama, Grace admitted. Part of me feels sorry for him, but part of me is still so angry. He threw us away like we meant nothing to him. Mrs. Williams spoke up. Grace, you've grown into a remarkable young woman. Whatever you decide to do about your father, I know it will be the right choice because it will come from your heart. Over the next 3 days, Grace continued to check on Robert as part of her volunteer duties. Each time she entered his room, he would look at her with hope in his eyes, waiting for some sign of forgiveness. But Grace remained professional and distant, treating him exactly as she would any other patient. On her final day before starting nursing school, Grace entered Robert's room to find him sitting up, looking stronger but still very thin. The doctor says I can leave tomorrow, Robert said quietly. I guess I'll be going back to the shelter. Grace nodded and checked his chart. Your blood pressure is much better. You need to keep taking the medication and try to eat regular meals. Grace, Robert said, his voice full of pain, I know you don't owe me anything, but I need you to know something. Every day for the past 9 years I've thought about that night. I've regretted it every single day. I know sorry isn't enough, but I am truly deeply sorry for what I did to you and your mother. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she set down his chart and sat in the chair beside his bed one last time. "Mr. Johnson," Grace said quietly, "I want you to know that you didn't destroy us. You tried to, but you didn't succeed. My mother is now a successful hotel manager. She's strong and happy. My little brother Hope is a bright, loving child who knows he's wanted. And I'm about to start nursing school so I can spend my life helping people." Robert's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so proud of you, Grace. All of you. We didn't succeed because of you," Grace continued. "We succeeded despite you. We found people who showed us real love and kindness, the kind of love you threw away." Grace stood up from her chair and looked down at her father. "I forgive you," she said simply. "Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger would make me like you, and I refuse to be like you. I forgive you, but that doesn't mean I want you in my life. You made your choice 9 years ago, and now you have to live with it." Robert nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Grace. Thank you for being a better person than I ever was." Grace walked to the door and turned back one last time. "Goodbye, Mr. Johnson. I hope you find some peace." "Grace," Robert called softly as she reached the door. "Your mother was right. I didn't know what I was throwing away until it was gone. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too foolish to see it." Grace didn't respond. She simply walked out of the room and out of Robert's life forever. Years later, Grace graduated nursing school at the top of her class and became one of the most respected nurses at City General Hospital. She specialized in emergency care, and her colleagues often said she had a gift for comforting patients in their darkest moments. Grace never forgot that terrible night when she was 9 years old and the hospital staff had laughed at her desperation. Because of that memory, she made sure that every patient who came through the emergency room doors was treated with dignity and compassion, regardless of their ability to pay. "Grace has healing in her hands," Dr. Rodriguez would tell new medical students. "Watch how she treats patients and you'll learn what it truly means to be a healer." Grace married a kind doctor she met during her residency, and they had 2 beautiful children. She raised them with the same love and values that Mrs. Williams and her mother had shown her. Sarah continued to thrive in her career and eventually became the general manager of the Grand Plaza Hotel. Hope grew up to be a talented artist and teacher, spreading joy and creativity wherever he went. Mrs. Williams lived to see Grace become everything she had dreamed of and more. She passed away peacefully at the age of 85, surrounded by the family she had chosen: Grace, Sarah, Hope, and Grace's children. Her house was filled with laughter and love until her very last day. Grace never saw her father again after that day in the hospital, but sometimes she would hear about him from other hospital staff. Robert had continued to struggle with his health and his homelessness. He never remarried and never found the happiness he had thrown away. People who knew him at the shelter said he would sometimes talk about his daughter who had become a nurse, and how proud he was of her even though he had lost the right to call her his own. On a cold winter evening, nearly 10 years after their last meeting, Grace received word that Robert had died quietly in his sleep at the homeless shelter. He had left behind only one possession, a small, worn photograph of Grace as a little girl, the one he had carried with him every day since he had thrown his family away. Grace attended his funeral not as his daughter, but as someone who had once known him. She stood at the back of the nearly empty chapel and listened as the chaplain spoke about forgiveness and redemption. After the service, Grace placed a single white flower on Robert's casket. "You were my first patient, Mr. Johnson," she whispered. "I hope you finally found the peace you were looking for." As Grace walked out of the chapel and back to her beautiful life with people who truly loved her, she thought about the promise she had made to herself as a frightened 9-year-old girl on a cold, rainy street. "I will never leave you, Mommy. I will never be like Daddy." She had kept that promise. Grace had chosen love over abandonment, compassion over cruelty, and forgiveness over bitterness. She had become everything her father never was and everything her mother had raised her to be. The little girl who had once begged strangers for help had grown into a woman who spent her life helping others. The child who had been thrown away had become someone who made sure no one else would ever be discarded. Grace had learned that sometimes the people who hurt us the most teach us the most important lessons about who we want to become. And in the end, that made all the difference. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next video.